Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to everyone who's listening online. I'm very pleased that I have the opportunity this afternoon to actually talk to you about a bioeconomy for society, because it's something that we've been talking about for some time now, and I had multiple corridor conversations with people who said, what does it actually mean? What is it? So I decided to actually do a road show and talk to people about it and have a conversation about what we actually mean about a bioeconomy for society. And this is the last one in that three-part series. We've already been to Burnie, been to Launceston, and now today here at Sandy Bay. It's, for me, actually a very personal issue, and that's why I want to take you on a little bit of a personal journey, because it goes right back to my very early days as an undergraduate, when I was sitting through my first lectures in agricultural economics within the first few weeks of arriving at university. And I felt a deep discomfort about the way agricultural production and food was being portrayed. And that relates to the way we actually structure our economy. So what I've learned as an undergraduate, and I'm sure that most of you have heard these sort of things before, is that our economy is structured into three sectors. We've got the primary sector, which is sort of the extraction of raw material, mining, fishing, and agriculture. A secondary sector around manufacturing, which is concerned with finished goods, factories, making stuff. And then the tertiary sector, which is about service, concerned with offering the intangible goods and services to consumers. That includes retail, tourism, banking, entertainment, IT, and interestingly, also education. And that is often accompanied by these types of graphs, world value by sector, and you see agriculture sort of at the bottom here, largely insignificant. Often these sorts of things are then complemented with a statement such as, a primitive economy will be primarily based on the primary sector, with most people employed in agriculture and the production of food. There are quite a few problems with that statement, but one of the major ones is that it immediately equates the status of an economy with the dominance of a sector and then linking employment directly to it, as if that was the most important performance indicator of that sector. For me, what was missing was livelihoods, nutrition, simply the fact that we need to eat. Often these sorts of things are then accompanied by maps, and that's actually from a very recent publication from the World Development Indicators, and it's in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I will talk a little bit more about those later. And it shows employment by sector for 2016, and again, what it shows over here is that a primitive economy is dominated by employment in the agricultural sector. While some of that might be true, I question the relevance of it, and we come to that. A little bit later during my undergraduate studies, I was then exposed to Keynesian economics, and we had a few discussions with our lecturers, and they admitted that that sort of three-sector model was somewhat flawed, and that there are some fixes that we can actually make to them by adding a quaternary sector for all of the intellectual activities involving education and research, and maybe even a quinary sector that's reserved for the high-level decision makers in government and in industry. And all of that, of course, is based on some of the work that William Petty did in the 17th century. He's actually the inventor of the concept of the GDP. And again, it's something that I'll talk a little bit later on, that simply looks at a very simplified version of what's happening in an economy based on consumption, investment, government expenditure, and the net product of exports minus imports. None of that sat comfortably with me in terms of what agriculture and food actually provides to our economy. Because all that was happening at a time when we had just experienced the Green Revolution. We had two of the pioneers of the Green Revolution, like Norman Borlaug and Professor Swaminathan, who single-handedly, through their work, probably helped 1 billion people out of starvation. It was a huge success of what the connection between science, communities, government, and action on the ground can actually achieve. At the same time, we started to realize all of the unintended consequences that came with it. This is just epitomizes some of those unintended consequences. We are still talking about the effects of pesticides on the food chain, on human beings, on the ecosystem. And suddenly all these types of negative side effects of agricultural production started coming to the fore. And then in the early days of my career, I got really interested in agricultural systems because we wanted to quantify those interactions a bit better. We wanted to understand the connection between agricultural production, between the use of resources, and the impact that that use of the resources actually has on the environment, and understand those cycles and make sure that we can actually come up with management practices and management strategies that are optimal for what we actually want to achieve. We needed to ask the question, what is it that we wanted to achieve? And as part of that, I was involved in the development of some fairly complex software that sits behind it that allows us to mimic those agricultural systems, but also going out into the fields and talking to farmers in our patch of the world. Most of that was done on the Darling Downs in Queensland, but also through some of our international work, where we actually started talking to the producers. And that was at a time when I still had dark hair. So it didn't sit comfortably with that early notion about a primary sector that is the hallmark of a primitive economy. Because we also started talking about what does sustainable agriculture actually mean. And I'm not reading out the definition here for you. I mean, that's just one of many, but it's one that makes sense to me. But essentially, sustainable agriculture is about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the future. And there are all different ways of how you can actually unpack that. But what is really important from my perspective is that last bit here on the slide, and that is that true sustainability does not discriminate by size, by ownership, ideology, culture, politics, location, or religion. It is an outcome and result-focused activity that is irrespective of the ideologies. Because quite often when we talk about sustainable agriculture, we very quickly get into an argument about ideology. And we have to be careful that we don't conflate different concepts. I'm saying all that because I try to paint that complexity of the picture that we have when it comes to agriculture and food production and contrast that with some of those simplistic ways that we have of actually measuring it. So from my perspective, what we've just talked about is not the hallmark of a primitive economy that will be primarily based on the primary sector. I fundamentally challenge that sort of statement. Then during my PhD years and later during my first professorial appointment, I worked at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And this was a real eye-opener to me because here I was in a country that's 2/3 the size of Tasmania, but is the second biggest world net exporter of agricultural product by value. It's the US, the second is the Netherlands, and somewhere down here is Australia. Now, this is a country 2/3 the size of Tasmania. So what what are they doing right that we are not doing? Now, I have to be fair. You can't directly compare the Netherlands with Australia or Tasmania. The Netherlands is at the heart of 150 million consumers. So it's a very different type of ecosystem, very different type of infrastructure. But still, lessons that we can learn from that. At the same time, that issue of food security started to come on the horizon. We're talking the early 2000s. And then people started talking about food security, but it was a concept that really only concerned the developing countries. A little bit later in that decade, we then started having some of the political and financial crises. And the Arab Spring and the revolution was actually called a revolution of the hungry. And it reminded me of that phrase that came from Alfred Henry Lewis in the early 1900s, who said that there are only 9 meals between mankind and anarchy. And that's actually a term that Lord Cameron used in the House of Lords in England when they first started talking about food security. And that's sort of what brought it onto the agenda in Europe, because it really resonated. And then, of course, later on, the issues around the Arab Spring. So that sort of drove home that notion that unless we have that continuous and reliable source of food, our societies are going to break down. And I was in the Netherlands, and I reflected on what makes it so different. Why do we have these sorts of discussions here, and the economy is flourishing, and agriculture and agricultural production and the agricultural environment is actually valued within that ecosystem? And I started to reflect on people's relationship with landscape, with food, with production. And I found a fundamental difference between the way a European society views the landscapes and the way we here in Australia view our landscapes. And I'll just show you a few pictures, and I put that one in the middle here, because that's actually a photo that I took on a farm. And there are signs for people who are walking about where the nearest places to visit are, where the nearest restaurants are. It's on a private farm. It's on private property. Now, if I drive from here to Launceston, which is what I will do later on today, I drive along the Midland Highway for over 2 hours. And there's not a single place along that Midland Highway where I could comfortably stop and engage with the landscape around me. As soon as I get out of the car, there are fences. There's signs, no trespassing, private property. It sets up a completely different mindset about how we actually engage with our landscapes. Landscapes really include the natural as well as the built environment. At the same time, production can be understood as a description of a process of creating abundance. And when you actually analyze the word production, you go back to its Latin roots. That's what is meant by production, creating abundance. And for me, it's actually a beautifully multifaceted term that includes creating abundance of wealth, but also of knowledge, of art, of social capital, of new values, diversity, beauty. And I often think about what Van Gogh did when he lived in southern France and painted those beautiful sunflowers. He actually used the productive landscape in his art, which we now all admire, which we all can relate to. Can't we create these sorts of environments so that we can engage with that? Which brings me to the bioeconomy, because around about that time in mid-2000s, that term bioeconomy started to be used more and more. And down here, I'm simply showing you bibliometric analysis of the frequency with how the term was used from 2005 onwards. And back then, it was still a very narrow concept. It was largely about biotechnology and how we use biotechnology in an economic context in order to add value to our economies. That whole social element of it, that whole environmental element of it, was not present when they first started talking about it. But since then, the situation has changed. And I need to sort of walk you through that a little bit, because there are quite a few initiatives globally happening at the moment that sit behind that. For instance, there are some evolving thoughts about big transformation. One of them was in 1971 when Nicholas Rögen applied the concept of thermodynamics and entropy to economics. And it was actually interesting for some of you who might have been at Academic Senate last Friday that our Vice-Chancellor did exactly the same thing, talking about our bureaucracy, where we now have reached a low point of entropy, which you can equate with bureaucratic stalemate and lack of progress. But Nicholas Rögen applied that concept, and it changed the way people started to think about economics. I need to point out he was also a student of Joseph Schumpeter, who created that term of creative destruction around innovation. His point was that whenever you innovate something, you actually stop doing something else. That's that creative destruction element. So the printing presses destroyed the working opportunities for scribes. The internet destroyed the printing presses. There are thousands of these sorts of examples in our economy. Then in 2002, Paul Crutzen coined the term the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch in which humans demonstrably alter the planet. Then in 2009, Joseph Rockström came up with the 9 planetary boundaries, and there's a diagram of those over here. And in 2011, Steve Jobs said that the biggest innovations of the 21st century will be at the intersection of biology and technology. A new era is beginning. I just quickly need to elaborate on those 9 planetary boundaries a bit, because one of my colleagues, Bruce Campbell, recently published a paper where he demonstrated that we have already transgressed at least 3, if not 4, of those planetary boundaries. And they are particularly genetic diversity, but also in the biochemical flows, nitrogen and phosphorus are beyond what can be remedied from that sort of natural boundary perspective. And interestingly, they all relate to agricultural production. So we have a huge responsibility there in order to ensure that we don't further transgress these boundaries. There are also the global grand challenges that are a lot talked about these days. And you can categorize them in 2 groups. The resource needs, which are about energy, the environment, food, shelter, space, and water. And when you look at those resource needs, all of them have some sort of agricultural production element embedded in them. And then, of course, there are the social needs: disaster resilience, governance, health, learning, prosperity, security, etc. And in relation to that, Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the UN, actually said that we are the first generation to be able to end poverty, and the last generation that can take steps to avoid the worst impact of climate change. Future generations will judge us harshly if we fail to uphold our moral and historical responsibilities. And then there are the Sustainable Development Goals. Australia is one of 193 countries that is committed to achieving these 17 Sustainable Development Goals by the year 2030. So how we are tracking sort of categorized over here. I just highlighted some of the key ones that really involve agriculture. Those Sustainable Development Goals are supposed to be a roadmap for development efforts up to 2030 and beyond. And they're no longer just about the developing countries. They are global. They apply to us all. Now I've come across a really interesting diagram. The Stockholm Resilience Centre has actually clustered those Sustainable Development Goals into those that relate to the biosphere, those that relate to the society, and those that relate to the economy. Well, I think it's a beautiful image that actually highlights what we mean by the bioeconomy for society. So society is sandwiched between those economic goals and those goals that we need to develop for the biosphere. And then there's another problem, of course, and that's related to waste. 1/3 of food produced for human consumption is lost or wasted. And this waste of resources relates to all sorts of suboptimal processes that we have in our value chains. And you can argue about the colors in here. And I think to some extent the map is designed so that you argue about the colors in order to unpick it. I can't immediately explain why Canada should be in the high category and the US in the low category. That intuitively doesn't make much sense to me, but there's probably something in the algorithm behind it that will explain it. The point is not to get it right for every country. The point is to understand what are the drivers, that those drivers differ depending on your socioeconomic circumstances, and that we need to do something about it. So these grand global challenges, the planetary boundaries, and the sustainability development goals are big problems. And they actually get in the way of local agency. Because the more you talk to people about those big global problems, the more they shut down and they say there's absolutely nothing that I personally can do about it. We won't solve these grand global challenges, and we won't make progress on our sustainable development goals just by doing more science or by doing better science. We're talking about human stories here, not scientific stories. We need to engage at the human level. We need to engage at the emotional level with people in order to make progress. Science can't provide all of the moral energy that is required to solve these problems that involve value judgments about how we want to live our lives. This is not a science question. But science has some of the answers. Science has some of the suggestions that we need to take on board. The key is that a very large global problem undermines the sense of agency and engagement that people have. So just talking about these problems won't get us any further. We therefore need to design the problem to fit the capabilities. So the grand global challenges must be addressed via a political process, and that must be driven by future-minded political leaders. And we have a responsibility to engage with those political leaders and inform them appropriately, because we do have a lot of knowledge that potentially can contribute to it, but we need to find a way to engage. So it's not about a particular technology or about a particular scientific path. It is how about we think about the future and our own agency. To have real impact, science and scientists need to learn how to be humble. A partial contribution towards problem solving is the best we can hope for. And if we achieve that, we had impact. And that's what we're talking a lot about in our university. How do we achieve impact? We don't achieve impact by just talking about the big problems and hammering home technological solutions. And now I commit the crime that I warned you against not to commit, because I'm actually using figures such as the GDP in order to make a point. But I will explain, and hopefully I will be excused for committing that crime. Because now I come back to what that concept of the bioeconomy for society could actually mean for us here at our university. And that's an analysis that I've done recently, where I took the ABS figures and I actually looked at agriculture's contribution to the GDP by country and by state within Australia. So on the left-hand side here, you see the global average around 4%. You see Australia at about 2.5%, and you see New Zealand at about 7.5%. And over there, you've got countries such as Vietnam or PNG. If you break it down by state, you see that there's a huge variability within Australia in terms of our contribution to the cross-state product. But Tasmania has a disproportional size of it, around about 7.4%. Now, I told you before that these are inappropriate measures, but they matter. They matter because everybody uses them. Everybody talks about them. And if you watched TV last night, there was a huge song and dance about the fact that we had some so-called good numbers in our GDP. Well, I'll come to that in a minute, whether those numbers are good or not so good. So I want to ask you a question. What does the the GDP RBT, so random press testing, the ERA, Excellent Research Australia, and cricket have in common? Any ideas? When you look at them, and you look at their respective values of what they can measure, like the rate of growth, the number of RBT tests conducted, university rankings, and the match scores, they're all useful indicators of certain activities. But when a good performance indicator becomes the goal, the purpose is lost. It's all about purpose. We are not driving the GDP in order to have a good number. We are driving it in order to have a good economic outcome, a good social outcome, a good outcome for our society. We are not conducting random press tests because we want to get up the numbers. We're doing it because we want to keep the roads safe. We are not going through the ERA because we want to be the best in the country. We are doing it in order to demonstrate that our research makes a difference. And I don't think we are playing cricket just to win. So I think they have a lot to do with each other, and we need to keep an eye on the purpose. So the sectoral contribution to the GDP is, in my opinion, a fundamentally flawed means of measuring impact. We say that the world's share of agriculture to the GDP is 4%. Two problems. It uses a sector approach, and the sector approach is wrong. It uses a GDP approach, which is equally flawed. Sectors don't capture the pervasiveness and the pervasive nature of agriculture and food. Unlike any other commodity, food is one essential that cannot be postponed. 9 meals from anarchy. It ignores the contribution of biological systems to the broader economy and to society. And it does not recognize the cross-cutting nature of some of the core enablers, such as education and social networks. On the other hand, the GDP is seriously flawed as a measure of welfare. It ignores leisure activity. It ignores all of the unpaid family work. It ignores distribution. Inequalities continues to rise across our economies. And we should stop looking for policies to raise the GDP and look instead for policies that promote happiness and well-being. And even if a higher GDP was a good idea, on all sorts of grounds, it is not feasible because the environmental damage would be too great if we just drive that. The perverse outcome of being GDP driven is that if you had an oil spill in a remote area and you have to spend billions of dollars on cleaning it up, it would actually improve your GDP. not exactly the sort of outcome we envisage. So bioeconomy for society, it's not sector-driven, it's not driven by the GDP. What is it? The simple definition would be sustainable production and use of all biological resources, processes and principles to provide products and services to society and its economic sector. Sectors still exist, but when we talk about a bioeconomy, we mean all of these sectors. Everything where biological processes have a contribution to make. Agriculture, forestry, fisheries, food, fiber, paper, textiles, building and construction, energy, chemistry, ICT, pharma, health. It continues. And that's an image of the bioeconomy, which is used by the European knowledge-based bioeconomy network, and is actually quite influential in policy setting right across the EU at the moment. And they describe it as clusters with interlinked value chains. And these ones here at the top are the ones that are the obvious ones that we are working in: agriculture, fisheries, aquaculture, the food industry, but then also the chemical industry, for instance. The pharmaceutical industry, important for Tasmania. I mean, we make a big contribution in terms of our poppy production. And the list goes on. And what it has food, biomass, and non-food in the center, and produces all these types of services that sit around it. But as soon as you put up a concept like that, particularly in universities, particularly to academics, they all get excited because they all point fingers. But you overlooked this, or you missed that. There's nothing that academics love more than arguing about these sorts of concepts. So as soon as the bioeconomy concept came around, people said, that's all rubbish. You need to look at that circular aspect of it. So they put up a comprehensive concept of a circular economy. And that's fine. I don't have too many arguments with that picture. But that wasn't good enough. You needed to distinguish between the green and the blue. So another concept. Again, I don't have too many issues with that. And then, of course, the green economy. How can you forget the green economy? We're not just talking about biotech here. And again, I don't have any issues with that. The point is, the concept is actually being used. Whilst academia argues about the details, people are getting on with business. That's an example of the Clarence City Council that actually developed a Coal Valley development strategy. That's just on our doorstep here. So they now have a bioeconomy sector group. So whilst we are arguing about concepts, people start developing policies around it. And that's at the local level within Tasmania. At the global level, there are now many, many countries that already have established bioeconomy policies around the world. And they've done that largely in the absence of academia contributing to it. So we need to make ourselves relevant. We need to be in there. We need to start being present and understanding what our purpose is and what we can contribute. This is an example out of the German bioeconomy policy, where they actually break it down in terms of the various components and what they contribute. And they found that high tech, for instance, contributes 28%, whilst bioeconomy research and innovation, which is largely where we would come under, contributes 80% to the overall pie. But when you scale that up to a European level, you find that the EU's bioeconomy turnover exceeds 2 trillion euros by now. It's huge. And nearly 3/4 of that is made up of food, beverages and agriculture. Now, whilst policies are being developed, and science is still largely absent, I think there is a great opportunity for us. And it comes back to the point that I made earlier about that big global problem and the lack of local agency. Because what I've done here is I just looked at two policy documents. I took the FAO country profiles, which are on the left-hand side, and I mapped them against Tasmania's Sustainable Agri-Food Plan from 2016 to 2018. And the language is amazingly similar. We are talking about safe, nutritious food in both policies. We are talking about sustainable use of resources for agriculture and food production on the one hand, and sustainably growing the agriculture and food sectors on the other hand. We're talking about climate change versus biosecurity and climate risk management. And the list goes on. So for us, for TIA, in that new space where we are now a research institute within the new college structure, this is a great opportunity to demonstrate our global reach and our local relevance. So what are the future roles of the bioeconomy for society? So bioeconomy refers to sustainable use and production of natural resources. And the concept has been adopted globally, as I demonstrated, in the way governments and businesses are now making decisions and how communities are engaged. It is a true paradigm shift. And we have a choice whether we engage with that agenda or not. There is significant funding associated with it. Horizon 2020 in the EU, for instance, has a big chunk of their resources earmarked just for bioeconomy work. And Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is also heavily engaged in that agenda. So it's industry as well as government sources that are starting to fund it. For me, the most important point is that this concept, this way of thinking, makes agriculture and food production relevant to everybody by articulating its purpose and not just its problems. There are 5 cornerstones of a global bioeconomy for society, and that's been published in a recent Nature paper. The first one relates to international collaboration, because in such a complex system, without good international collaboration between governments and public and private researchers, we can't achieve anything. It's about knowledge sharing. The second one is how do we actually measure the progress towards agreed priority targets, be that in food and nutrition, in open data platforms, in national sustainability monitoring systems, or in the 2050 challenge about how we sustainably feed nearly 10 billion people by 2050. The third one is about a link between the multilateral policy processes and making sure that we actually understand the intricacies that sit behind that. We're talking about climate change, biosecurity, biodiversity. The fourth one should be particularly important for us. It's about collaborative education. It's about a modern interdisciplinary curriculum that actually delivers the learning outcomes that our students need. It's about system thinking. It's about modeling, strategic planning, open learning platforms. And then finally, it's about international research and development support programs, new food systems, biorefineries, artificial photosynthesis. There's a lot of work going on in that area at the moment. And of course, good global governance. There are different ways how we can measure progress. And it's very important that we do measure progress. And I'm glad that Kathy is here because that's one of your key topics. Traditionally, we measure it as the bioeconomy as a share of GDP and employment. And I already pointed out all the problems that are associated with that. We can take another step and say, you actually look at it more from a physical perspective. Look at the share of renewable bio-based content in economies, products and services, for instance. I would argue that we have to have much more pervasive measures of measuring our progress. We need to move towards outcome measures, such as farm income and well-being, reduce carbon emissions, improved sustainability indicators, education and skills. The problem, of course, is that they're not as convenient as just coming up with a single number. But I think it's time that we actually measure what we should and not what we can. That's what I mean by bioeconomy for society. The fact that that already resonates with some of our key stakeholders is demonstrated over here. This is an image that's actually from the National Farmers Federation, backing rural Australia, future-proofing our farmers through sustainability and ag-tech solutions. So we're not alone here. Even some of our conservative lobby groups are actually behind that agenda now. Okay, let me come to the chase about what it actually means for TIA. Developing Tasmania's bioeconomy for society, we've actually taken on 3 key planks, which we see as our core business. The first one is an ag-tech strategy. It's technology-driven transformation that involves things like breeding, engineering, IT, business management, financing, marketing, communications, HR management on farm, that very knowledge-intensive part of the farming business. The second component is around sustainability, soils, water management and governance, particularly important for Tasmania, where we're rolling out irrigation on a very rapid rate and where we have very ambitious growth targets for agriculture and food. And here, our challenge is how do we avoid problems before they impact on our social license? How do we avoid things like nutrient runoff, erosion, water use, issue around bobby calves, GM, the moratorium, all these sorts of things. Very important role for TIA to play, particularly now that we are that institute and that we are a lot more visible. The third component is obviously around microbiology, food safety and innovation, one of our key strengths, where we need to continue with our consumer focus, with functional value chains, the value creation, educating the world about a lot of those issues, and increasingly a commercial orientation, like what we're doing with the MATS program or the upcoming launch of CB Premium. If somebody doesn't know what it is, I encourage you to find out. All that is perfectly strategically aligned, and it is in our strategic plan. It's locally, nationally, and internationally aligned. So clearly these are the things that we are doing and that we should be doing into the future. One of them is also much more actively engaging with the private sector. And that's just one example of what we're doing with Driscolls at the moment, where we're helping them to create the perfect strawberry. We've actually went through a very active listening exercise with our international partner and simply asked them, what do you want from research? What are your issues? And what we heard was that at the moment they have an exclusive internal research and development focus on developing varieties, but a huge gap in their supply chain and serious concerns about social license. They had a very strong supply chain disconnect between consumers and growers. And they were very interested in our industry focus and in the reputation that we already have in that field and the research that we are doing. So clearly, we are very strongly aligned in terms of their needs and our objectives. And we are currently going through a pilot study with them in order to provide them with better visibility of their value chain. But it's not only the commercial aspect that's important for us, it's also the international public goods and the national public goods. And as a university, having a balanced portfolio that addresses both of those issues is very, very important. Because a lot of the things that I talked about earlier on are about those public goods where we have a responsibility to provide. And just some examples that we are already doing, like the regeneration of temperate grasses, storing that germplasm appropriately on a global scale, and of course looking within our own island and looking at the aspiration for food and agriculture and understanding that system a lot better. These are all very important projects for TEA. Which brings me back to my reflection about Wageningen University and the Dutch experience that I had. And I've taken that straight from Wageningen University, and that was the things we often discussed when I was still there. And it's a golden triangle. It's that combination of academia, industry, and government co-located on a modern campus, which really works well for the Dutch. They only have one university that focuses on agriculture and food, and they're co-located very closely with a lot of the headquarters of industry, and government listens to them. They have serious input into policy development. Now, there's a way we can make that work for us too, and you can't just transfer these models one for one, but you can look at them, you can learn from them, and you can adapt them to what might actually work in our case. And for me, the role of a university is reconciling the conflicting goals within the bioeconomy by creating private as well as national and international public goods for society. And we do that by having that explicit link between bioenergy, biomass use, ecology, nature, food and feed, and doing that in partnership with our core partners here, which is the civil society we have a responsibility to as a university, business and industry who keep supporting the work that we do, and government, of course, which is, in the case of TEA, an important joint venture partner. And right in the middle of that, negotiating some of those complex interactions, sits our university. And I very deliberately have not put TEA in the middle because it's much bigger agenda than TEA. It's a university agenda. And what I'm proposing with that research cluster, the bioeconomy for society, is something that fits 100% with our research themes that we have already articulated. So there are some missing links in that eco-agri-food system of ours. And I've just tried to articulate them a little bit better so that we can see where some of the other parts of our university might actually fit in. In the case of our own college of COSI, I mean, our core capabilities are in the STEM subjects, obviously. We have a very strong focus on biology, on chemistry, IT, logistics, spatial science, geography and design, and of course the three planks that are already outlined from TEA. But we've got three other colleges in our university. We've got the College of Health and Medicine, and clearly they have a responsibility to concentrate on human health, but also on diets and nutrition. So the link with agricultural production, food is obvious. Good health outcomes based on sustainable value chains. I think that college could make a tremendous contribution to that. TISBE, good resource economics, focus on consumer behavior and ethical marketing. Again, something that we need to tap into, that we need to ask them to take a lead in and actually help us to develop that agenda. And CALE, well, there's a lot of work going on social equity, on ethics, on justice, on collaborative governance in and for the bioeconomy for society. And again, it's for us to reach out and excite them so that they can actually take a leadership role in those areas. And I just want to go into a little bit more detail with that example of health, because that link between human health, diets and nutrition is an obvious one. And the reason why it's obvious is because calories are cheap and nutrition is expensive. If you look at these two meals over here, they have the same calorie value. That one has a very low nutritional density. That one has a very high nutritional density. It costs nearly 10 times as much, or 10 times as much, which gets back to affordability, to access, to equity in our communities. And in many places these days, obesity and hunger are not the tragic antagonists that they once were, but they're now the troubling twins. This is poverty as seen in most of the world, and this is poverty set originally on that cartoon in the US. I think Australia is exactly the same. And there's an interesting report that came out just a few weeks ago from the World Bank on One Health. And the very first box that they have in that report talks about the need for multi-sectoral public health systems. And it says, changing the organization of work across disciplines implies a substantial reorientation in which regular communication takes place between practitioners at work in different disciplines and sectors. That could have been written for agriculture and food. So bioeconomy for society, I think it provides an opportunity to focus all of our disciplines with our university on something that matters fundamentally for our future. And we just mapped a few initiatives, and I'm not claiming that that is comprehensive, but it just gives you a snapshot of some of the things that are already happening. And I've taken the liberty of putting Tia in the middle. People are welcome to change the diagram and put in the middle whatever they like. But I had the prerogative because I was giving the talk. So the purpose of today was simply to get you thinking about that concept, get you thinking about how we engage with our colleagues, with our industry partners, with government, with society, and how we can enable agency so that we can actually start acting. And my very large slide is simply an ad, because I'm on the organizing committee for a science forum in October. It's already oversubscribed, so there's no need in trying to get there. But you can certainly listen to a lot of the talks that will be given at that science forum online. And also I want to make you aware of it because it will result in some special issues of publications afterwards. Thank you very much for attending, and I'm very happy to answer questions if there are any. By the way, here's a book by the OECD, The BioEconomy to 2030. Just an example of a lot of the work that's going on, and there are many of these sorts of books.